Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced last week that the State Department is cutting 92% of grants from the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. That comes after Trump issued an executive order to freeze foreign aid spending as one of his first acts in office. The sudden gutting of USAID pulls the rug out from aid recipients around the world. I don't think this move is in America's national interest. Moreover, I think it's wrong to do it the way this administration is doing it. But beyond that, there's a lot about U.S. foreign aid that's up for debate. Questions like, what does it accomplish? Does it really help? How does it help? Should it continue? Or should foreign aid be scaled down over time? I have a few thoughts about these topics. I worked for USAID for more than 3 decades, developing communication strategies to promote reform in 20-plus developing countries. My guest for this episode brings to the discussion his experience as a veteran foreign correspondent. Gregory Warner is a Peabody Award-winning journalist who's been telling nuanced and insightful stories from around the world for many years. He was the creator and host of NPR's international podcast, Rough Translation. Before that, he was an international correspondent for NPR, based in East Africa. Gregory has reported on USAID on the ground in Africa, as well as in Ukraine and Afghanistan. He writes the Substack blog, Rough Transition. Gregory, welcome to Making Peace Visible. We're so glad you're here.
Thanks. Really glad to be here.
There's been so much misinformation about USAID in the last month since the effort to close it down began. It would be worthwhile to give a brief history of the program. I know you've thought about it a lot.
Sure. Happy to. USAID began in 1961 with an executive order from President John F. Kennedy. And this was the Cold War. So his idea was we are battling not only global communism, but messaging from the communists that we are greedy, ugly Americans only out for ourselves. So we need to give foreign aid and set up USAID to counter that messaging. From the beginning, it had a strategic objective. And originally, it was very much about economic growth. So you see the U.S. starting to construct railways and roads in places like Cameroon, or helping with rural development, trade infrastructure in Taiwan, and then following that aid, entering into trade agreements with these countries. In the 80s, people remember, I think, the famine in Ethiopia that hit television screens with such force. 1983 to 1985, that was a huge expansion of USAID in terms of feeding the poor. And then again, USAID entered a new sort of era, you could say, in the 2000s with PEPFAR, which was President George W. Bush's program to counter HIV/AIDS. It was a huge, huge program that apparently is the biggest life-saving program in the world.
It has an amazing track record.
Yeah, absolutely transformative. Changed the life expectancy in many countries. And then in the modern era, USAID has been involved in everything from education to democracy and governance to election reform.
I mean, it's worth asking, what is USAID really for? What is its mission in today's world?
I think it's really helpful to think of the mission of USAID in sometimes 3 contradictory ways. One, it's a humanitarian organization. That's what most people know about it. But second, it very much exists to create and subsidize market opportunities for American companies. And that might mean the humanitarian mission, food aid. I mean, we see right now a lot of food aid is stuck at ports in the United States because this is coming from U.S. farmers. Financing power plants in Democratic Republic of Congo to help U.S. mining companies compete with the Chinese. There's been a 15-year trade deal with Egypt to open up the Egyptian market to U.S. auto parts manufacturers. I think a lot of people don't understand this aspect of USAID is that it very much exists to create those networks. But then, of course, there's the political agenda. That's gotten the most attention recently because there's been a lot of focus on LGBT programs and DEI, which is just this tiny fraction of what the USAID funds. But also you have efforts to support election monitoring or democracy promotion or anti-Kremlin propaganda, very much involving itself in trying to change voter sensibility and the political climate of a country.
But, it's relatively easy to make the case that aid to combat the spread of infectious disease is a smart use of taxpayer dollars, since diseases know no borders. But I'm more interested in the case for other sorts of projects, I mean, other than the argument that it's the right thing to do, from what you've seen as a journalist, why should Americans provide humanitarian aid, particularly in conflicts where the U.S. has no direct military involvement, such as Sudan or DRC?
I think that one thing we should just establish as we're having this very nuanced and very important conversation about the value of aid is to say that what is happening now under Doge and under President Trump is not just the end of aid or the end of almost all of aid as we know it. It's a kind of shockwave that's been sent into the system.
Absolutely.
There was no notice for any of this. And so you have teachers heading to school in the middle of the Afghan winter. The school is closed. They're not going to be paid for the month. The kids are, turned away. I mean, everything is stopped. Even that emergency waiver that Marco Rubio issued to say that life-saving food and medicine would continue. I mean, I've talked to people who said, no, they're not seeing that money go through. The organizations are maybe paying for it out of their own pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to a friend in Mozambique, which is where the condoms for Gaza were actually really going, because they have the Gaza province in Mozambique where the very high AIDS incidence. And, that's all been stopped. And meanwhile, those people need those condoms to prevent more people from getting HIV.
Right. And they said it was for Gaza, even though it was the wrong Gaza. But I spoke with somebody in the Zambian Ministry of Health. They're looking at not only the specific delivery of HIV AIDS medication, but they're trying to understand, okay, what happens when you stop giving condoms to long-haul truckers who see sex workers? What happens when you stop giving patient education? What happens when you stop monitoring like monkeypox? Where are the vulnerabilities first in the system and trying to actually model that from an epidemiological perspective? And so we may not see the impacts of this. Well, we'll see, of course, the impacts right away. More people will die, go hungry, but the fragility that's been injected into the system maybe won't be sensed right away. And that's the longer term effect.
I think the fragility is one of the most dangerous things about this whole thing because it completely upends our reputation in a way.
Yeah, I think it does a certain thing too, which is doesn't just change our reputation. It changes how people see America as not consistent from administration to administration, but rather that everything now has to go through this one executive. That it's a sort of tactic which says there is no America. There is just whether Trump says yes or no. He's canceled even things that Biden had approved or were contracted under Biden's administration, ongoing projects that people had counted on that money and even spent it already, expecting the check to arrive. And I spoke to a young woman, a farmer in Kenya. She bought a solar dryer for her farm and USAID had promised her the money. She was super excited. She bought the dryer. It's now creating the medicinal herbs and allowing her to hire even more women farmers. I mean, we could have a debate and we should have a debate about whether or not USAID should fund a Kenyan woman farmer. Is that a use of U.S. taxpayer funds? But the fact is that she applied for the grant. She won the grant. She was promised the money. She signed a contract. And now that dryer is installed on her farm and she owes the money to the supplier. And if she can't pay, she's going to prison. Her whole farm is being taken away. And all the women who work for her are going to be fired. And all because she was just an ambitious entrepreneur. This is not somebody waiting for a handout. I mean, this was a grant that she applied for.
Right. And she believed in the U.S. government.
So that trust is really taking a blow.
No, I mean, the few grants that Doge posted on X that are canceled are, $1.5 million for voter confidence in Liberia, $14 million for social cohesion in Mali. I mean, I can say, having worked for the first democratically elected president of Mali as part of a USAID project, this kind of investment is very valuable. Mali suffered from a violent overthrow by Islamist groups from the north several years ago, and healing is badly needed in that country to prevent more violence.
That said, there's a lot of support for President Trump across the global south. And I've talked to people in Kenya, for example, who said, this is a great thing. Maybe not the way it was done, certainly not the way it was done. Haven't met a single person who thinks the way it was done is in any way good, but that this was a long time coming. And, aid has had its critics since the beginning. I mean, certainly under JFK, but But in the modern era, I mean, you can get a master's degree in how to reform aid. And I've never been to a USAID conference or meeting where people didn't criticize USAID and how it spends its money.
And during the Cold War, there was the idea that the U.S. had to prop up democracies. But the imperative isn't clear now. But is it still important to U.S. national interest?
You know, I was talking with a USAID employee in Ukraine, and he told me this May there was a directive that came down that I guess the implication was it was done since Trump was winning in the polls, and there was a sense that if this administration took power, it was going to take a hatchet to aid. And so the directive was, we need to start calculating what impacts our programs are having on GDP, which is fine, except I was shocked that that was not a metric before this. I mean, Samantha Power, who gave a speech in December 2024 to I think it was to Center on Foreign Relations, it was defending USAID. But in that speech, she said, the thing about USAID is that whenever I go to a country, whenever I go to a community, they always say the same thing. This was Samantha Power saying this, the former head of USAID. And she said, when I go to these places, they always tell me the same thing. We want trade, not aid. She says in that speech, she looked at the budget of USAID and she was shocked how small a percentage of the budget, I think when she took over, it was like 5%, actually went to core economic growth. And so the dynamic here is that a lot of places, they say, we want jobs, we want to build our economies, we don't want handouts, we don't want aid that ties our hands.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always efficient. I mean, during my 30 plus years working as a contractor, I worked on quite a few projects that worked really well and some that didn't. One project I worked on that was very successful, that USAID rated as outstanding, was helping rural farmers earn money growing sustainable products like honey and fish farming. But it was abruptly suspended because a bureaucrat in D.C. decided to shift funds from sustainable agriculture to HIV prevention. And at that time, HIV prevention programs were swimming in money they couldn't use properly. Our project, on the other hand, was helping poor farmers earn money with sustainable agriculture. So it was a win-win for everyone. So it's these arbitrary decisions and sometimes just the way the contracts are written that make it hard to change, when things change on the ground,
That's a perfect case study of what I've seen, which is that the priorities are set in Washington instead of in the places on the ground. I saw this all the time in Afghanistan when I was there in 2007, 2008. I mean, the total budget of USAID spending in Afghanistan was something like $30 billion. And the objective of USAID was very clearly about supporting the U.S. military. That makes sense. We were in the middle of a war. But the idea of USAID at the time was you support the projects for people who are willing to let the U.S. troops come through. Or if people are going to give the U.S. information about where Taliban positions are, then they will get a well or a school. And that kind of quid pro quo approach, which is set in Washington and is a kind of hearts and minds approach, does not take account of the realities on the ground where...
That's the biggest problem.
Exactly. Where perhaps the person getting the well or the school or whatever, they built it in such a way that it's built with their cousin's labor and it's only accessible to them and, their blood relatives. And then people become more resentful because they say, oh, see, the U.S. is supporting this warlord or this, this figure who's got the ear of the U.S. military. It feeds right into Taliban propaganda. So our attempt at winning hearts and minds can backfire.
Yeah. I mean, we interviewed a Haitian journalist, and I worked for a year in Haiti after the earthquake.
This was the episode last week. I loved this episode. It was so moving.
Yes, with Étienne Dupin.
Such a powerful episode. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Great work.
Thanks. And he pointed out that USAID vastly underperformed on its commitment after the 2010 earthquake. At the same time, he said NGOs that received aid funding performed so many of the functions that would normally be performed by the government that the government was kind of absolved of responsibility. And it just set up this whole status quo of dependency.
Yeah, I've often been struck, and maybe you've seen this too, I've just been struck with how corruption is understood so differently in donor countries versus in receiver countries or the places that receive the aid. When I brought up that Afghanistan story to officials in USAID, And I said, well, the well was built, here next to the village chiefs instead of maybe in a central location where it would be accessible to all. Their attitude in general was, yes, unfortunately, we're in a corrupt country. Corruption is going to happen. It's kind of one of the costs of doing business. If we apportioned, $75,000 to help X number of people and only this number of people were helped because a lot of it got siphoned off, that's unfortunate. And it's something we try to avoid, but at least people were helped. But, having been in villages in, say, Kenya, and I remember, the aid trucks show up, the SUVs, and the people get out, and there's a perception, wow, these workers that get out and help us, look at their nice salaries and look at their hardship pay and look at how they send their kids to private school. And there's sometimes a sense, where's this money going? That's, again, really more about perception, but is it unfortunately part of the reason that I do hear, some Kenyans who don't understand exactly what USAID is doing in their country are celebrating right now.
I'm interested in media and how we learn about things, how the media reports on things. I mean, USAID does some interesting things in support of journalism. For one thing, support a lot of journalist organizations in Ukraine. How is that handled? I mean, is the reporting independent? Is it biased in favor of the U.S.? Have you observed any of that?
Yeah, I think bias is often in the eye of the beholder.
Of course.
Many people will say that I'm biased, you're biased. I mean, yeah, none of us is immune, of course. Clearly, it is a very common tactic by dictators to accuse investigative reporters of being shills for another government. In fact, Russia has laws against this. They've terrorized journalists for this reason. In fact, many journalists who get USAID funding have fled. So clearly, it's an aspersion used by strongmen. That said, Ukraine is a particular kind of media environment. In the modern history of Ukraine, I don't know of any large media outlet that wasn't funded by somebody who's wealthy, some oligarch. Either, and that oligarch might be tied to the West or may get tied to the Kremlin. And you have an environment where, many Ukrainians I know, they read lots of different media because they say, this guy's biased this way, this one is biased that way, and let's figure out the truth somewhere in the middle. So I think what is the Trump administration's assertion is that USAID was acting in this deep state way, funding media in Ukraine, which was then publishing anti-Trump stories. And I think that came from a July 2019 piece that was written in collaboration with BuzzFeed News, which shed light on Rudy Giuliani's attempt to dig up negative information on Trump's political opponents in Ukraine.
Right. Impeachment number one.
Yeah, and that was then footnoted in a report by a CIA whistleblower that then sparked the impeachment. So that funding came through an organization called OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. My understanding was that almost half of their funding came from the U.S. They've just had to fire, according to an investigative journalist outlet, Correctiv in Germany, OCCRP has had to fire 40 people. And I was just kind of checking out the sort of stories that OCCRP has been publishing. And I'm just looking at their website now. Here's something about how Kyrgyzstan became a hub for sanctioned car exports to Russia. But then here's one about a crackdown on narcos reveals alleged Lithuanian trafficking group. It's a money laundering scheme in Papua New Guinea. So it's not a particularly anti-Russia or certainly not anti...
Yeah, it sounds like it's more anti-corruption.
It's anti-corruption. It's anti-corruption, and as far as I see, is pretty comprehensive.
I've heard our aid budget compared to the amount of money Americans spend on Halloween candy every year. Do you think people in government who recognize the value of foreign aid have missed opportunities to make a case for it to the American public?
I think the case that's probably not been made is how many American jobs are supported by USAID.
That's one very important point.
Because in this rhetoric that you see all kinds of rhetoric in the anti-USAID camp, everything from Musk saying it's criminal organization. These outlandish claims to a fairly reasoned argument that says, hey, we cannot afford to be the world's donor anymore, where that's not where we want to be as a country. So that's a completely reasonable argument. I think what needs to be factored in there is, okay, well, then how many American jobs are then going to be hurt by this? How many American farmers depend on this? And then that be factored into the case. I think what Samantha Power would also say, I mean, this is reading from her December 2024 speech, is that one reason that USAID's disbursements and priorities look the way they do is because of DC-based lobbyists. So for them, it's not about making the case to voters, it's about making the case to Congress and saying, oh, you should spend more on healthcare and making sure that particular companies were also helped. So the priorities are definitely set by Congress and set in DC. And I don't think the voters have much say in that.
What has your experience been covering USAID as a journalist?
Here's a useful story about Ukraine. So the U.S. government spends hundreds of millions of dollars actually supporting Ukrainian farmers on the front lines. They have contracts with the U.S. seed companies, with the John Deere tractor, and others. And the idea of this is twofold. One is you support Ukrainian farmers on the front lines so that when the Russians bomb their grain silos, they don't flee, because it's far easier for Ukraine to defend land where the civilians have not fled. But also because Ukraine is a breadbasket of Europe. It's a breadbasket of the entire region.
That's right. And Africa.
And Africa, exactly. Northern Africa. So yeah. A lot of that grain and protection of those farmers directly relates to food security, and not to mention inflation and the price of wheat. So you look at something like aid to farmers, it's a very quid pro quo relationship. Let's give American seed companies those contracts, but it has this geopolitical stability aim. And then the program that I spoke with, they haven't been able to get those farmers those seeds. In fact, they're not even allowed, because of USAID's rules now, they're not even allowed to call the farmers and notify them that the seeds aren't coming.
It's amazing.
And so they're not getting to do the planting. Will they get their winter planting? Probably not. And so the knock-on effects, I mean, I'm wondering what'll happen then to those farmers, and what happens when those sorts of mass migrations start happening.
And, the food that feeds Europe and feeds part of Africa, I mean, it has ripple effects all the way down the line. Do you think there's a future for USAID? What might that look like?
I mean, I think that is a question for the courts, who are right now hearing cases on the legality of the Trump administration's executive orders. And then even the Trump administration has talked about possibly folding the USAID into the State Department in some way. But I have talked with USAID officials who've been surprisingly optimistic. They say that USAID has a role, and that role will be clear, and that it'll come back from the ashes. So we'll see.
Well, I hope so, because I have seen good things happen from USAID projects where they made meaningful changes in people's lives. But, yes, of course, I mean, in any kind of massive government program, there's going to be some waste or some, like you said, it can be looked at as a cost of doing business, so to speak. But we'll see what happens in the near future. We're getting near the end, and I was wondering, are there any things that you'd like to say that I didn't ask?
A story that does come to mind was one that I reported some years ago in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I've been thinking a lot about the DRC recently, because I believe last year...
Because of what's going on there.
Yeah. I mean, it was the largest recipient of U.S. humanitarian assistance, almost $1 billion. And what many people may know about DRC is that it's, especially in the east of the country, it's highly unstable. There are a number of militia groups which are battling for control over these illegal mines, which mine the very minerals that are in our cell phones and laptops. So this is sort of conflict fueled by our own markets, technology markets. But one of the things that's very common in these groups, unfortunately, is the use of sexual violence, the use of rape as a weapon of war. Because that has really caught the attention of the American news consumer, at least it had in the past, there had been more money earmarked toward helping survivors of sexual violence. So when I was there in the DRC and I was co-reporting one of these stories for Rough Translation, my podcast, we found that, in fact, the incentive to have to say that you were a victim of sexual violence in order to get a bag of food, bag of rice, was there. And it was very painful for some of the women that I spoke to. One woman, she still agonizes about it. She says there are real survivors out there and they're too ashamed to come forward. And meanwhile, I'm hungry and I knew I had to feed my brother. And so I came forward and I told this story. And so I was struck not only by her honesty, but by her guilt. And I thought, gosh, here's what happens when we translate empathy across multiple borders and across language, where we're reading the newspaper, we think, gosh, I really think we should support that group, and we should. But at the end of that line, there are people having to make hard choices. And so it shows some of the messiness. It's just a warning for us about how a conversation in DC or a priority set in the US changes people's lives in ways that we can't really expect. And that's, of course, what we're looking at right now, where a political debate and a political fight over the federal government is sending these shockwaves into people's lives.
The thing is, it's only because the administration doesn't want to have a real discussion about the purpose of USAID in Congress, which would be the right way to go about, reforming the program. They just wanted to shut it down and let Elon Musk do all the dirty work. It's not the right way to do it, that's for sure.
Well, even worse than that, I think in some ways, it actually sends its own message. It's not only the wrong way to do it, as if there's a kind of right way and there's a worse way and then there's the very worst way, but it's a very clear message that says, oh, this is not just about changing our priorities of USAID, it's changing the power relationship. So it's saying, in the past, Congress apportioned money, there was a system, it was consistent from administration to administration. Now we on a dime can do whatever we want. And if you want any kind of money, and this is a message to the leaders of these countries, you're going to have to play ball with us, specifically with those in the executive, as opposed to anybody in the State Department or the diplomats and such, because they are suddenly rendered much more impotent.
One of the be careful what you wish for kinds of impacts that, making this sudden cut to USAID is that it could cause more immigration coming into the United States because it'll increase poverty and violence in the countries that send immigrants to us. That could be a really negative way for it to backfire.
Yeah, so you're asking if that might happen. I'd probably not be comfortable as a journalist saying what I predict to happen, since the only people worse than economists at predicting are journalists. But certainly injecting instability into the world in the way in which this is done will exacerbate migration around the world. So what does that mean? Is the U.S. immune from that? I don't know. I mean, I think the other thing, though, to say about that is that one of the reasons you see, and this is maybe a bigger answer, but just to see one of the global trends that, of course, you've been following and we've been seeing has everything to do with the rise of the far right in Germany and the rise of populist parties. And even in the global South, a kind of popularity of Donald Trump is a general sense that the time for globalization, the time for meddling, the time for cooperation, that neoliberalism ideal has not worked. And sorry, I'll get around back to migration, but I think it's easy to perhaps say that there's a direct relationship to us feeding people in refugee camps in one area, and then if they're not fed, they're going to go somewhere where they can find food. Sure. But another thing that people hope for is that there could be more political accountability in those very governments, that the voters themselves will say, hey, listen, since we're not getting these subsidies from the U.S., we realize we're not getting basic services from our governments. We're going to stand up and say, hey, no, we need a different government in power. Now, do those people have the power, have the resources to be able to demand change in a more accountable leader? Some people that I've spoken to say that no, in some ways, USAID has blinded us and it's allowed for incompetent leaders to continue power because they don't have to be accountable. to their constituents and to the social compact.
The aid puts a kind of cushion under, some of the bad things that local leaders are doing.
One of the things I love about this podcast is the focus on what are we not seeing in the media narrative. And we live in such an American media bubble, or at least those listeners who are in America are in that bubble. I don't think all of your listeners are in the US, but perhaps a Western media bubble where we often filter these stories through an American lens.
We're downloaded in 124 countries, so.
Oh, I believe it. Just to, put a plug in, I would say that one of the things that I'm trying to do, originally when I left Rough Translation, my podcast, and started a new Substack called Rough Transition, it's a bit of a joke.
Right, very appropriate
It's
name.
a bit of a joke, but then it seemed to me that we all are kind of in a rough transition of sorts. The more I spoke with people who are dealing with instability in their lives or trying to figure out what to do next when huge things happen that they completely did not expect, they seem resonant with what's happening here. And so not just in a kind of emotional way, but in a practical way. Like, it's helpful for me to hear the story of a Kenyan farmer kind of trying to decide what to do about their farm and about the kind of their creditors, because suddenly I realized, wait, in this different world, where are the new weaknesses? What are the new expectations? And, what's coming down the line? So that's sort of what I'm trying to offer with that newsletter.
Well, I think you've been doing a great job. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you very much for joining us. Tell us, where can our listeners find your work?
Well, right now, the best place is on Substack, and the web address is just, if they could go to Substack app and search Rough Transition, or just type in my name, Gregory Warner, Substack.com, and it'll pop right up.
Gregory, thank you. I really appreciate this conversation. And it's very timely.
It's my pleasure. I'm a fan and happy to be here.
You can follow Gregory Warner's latest work in his Substack blog, Rough Transition, at gregorywarner.substack.com. It's free to subscribe. You can also explore the full archive of Gregory's NPR podcast, Rough Translation, wherever you listen to podcasts. You'll find beautifully told stories from around the world that will help you see familiar issues in a whole new way. In our show notes, we have a link to the episode about aid for survivors of sexual violence in the Congo that Greg talked about. We know some of our listeners have worked in fields that touch USAID, like peacebuilding, humanitarian assistance, and international development. Do you have a story about foreign aid you'd like to share? Find us on LinkedIn at Making Peace Visible to keep the conversation going. You can also write to me directly at jamil@makingpeacevisible.org. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Maraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.